If you make me sign those papers today, Melissa, you won't just lose my trust. You'll lose every right to speak for me again. The words did not come from a judge, a lawyer, or a police officer. They came from Evelyn Parker, a 68-year-old widow in a navy cardigan, standing in the polished lobby of First Community Bank with her purse clutched in one hand and a folder of documents balanced in the other. For one suspended second, even the air seemed to stop moving. Melissa's hand froze halfway across the desk, her glossy pink nails resting on the signature page she had been pushing toward her mother for the last 10 minutes. The teller behind the counter looked down. A man waiting in line glanced up from his phone. And Evelyn, who had spent most of her life speaking softly, realized that silence was exactly what had almost cost her everything. Just 15 minutes earlier, Melissa had been all smiles, guiding her mother through the glass doors as if this were a harmless errand before lunch. She had even joked about stopping for soup and sandwiches afterward, the same way she used to when Evelyn took her shopping as a little girl. That was what made the whole thing feel so disorienting. Melissa was not yelling. She was not rude. She was patient in that polished, practiced way that made everyone else in the room think she was simply a devoted daughter, helping her aging mother manage paperwork. She pulled out chairs. She translated banking terms Evelyn already understood. She answered questions that had been directed to Evelyn, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And every time the banker paused, Melissa leaned in with the same line. It's just standard authorization, Mom. It makes things easier. Easier for whom? Evelyn had started to wonder. She had not always been suspicious of her daughter. In fact, for most of Melissa's life, Evelyn had been the one person who answered every late-night call, every emergency, every tearful promise that things would be different next time. When Melissa's first marriage collapsed, Evelyn helped with rent. When she wanted to start a small online boutique, Evelyn dipped into savings to cover the launch. When Melissa said she was overwhelmed after the divorce and needed help with groceries, gas, and daycare, Evelyn never made her feel ashamed for asking. She told herself that family helped family. She told herself that love was supposed to be generous. What she had not understood until recently was that generosity, offered too freely and too long, could slowly train the wrong person to see kindness as access. Over the past year, little things had shifted. Melissa had started asking unusually specific questions about Evelyn's accounts, her monthly deposits, the way the house title was structured, whether the old will had ever been updated after Harold died. She had offered to organize paperwork in Evelyn's home office, and insisted on keeping copies of things Evelyn did not remember agreeing to share. At Christmas, she brought up estate planning over pie as casually as if she were discussing the weather. On Mother's Day, she arrived with flowers, kissed Evelyn on the cheek, and spent 40 minutes explaining why it would be smarter to put someone younger on every account. Someone reliable. Someone who could step in fast if something happened. Evelyn had smiled then, but the phrase stuck with her like a splinter. Someone younger. Someone reliable. Today, sitting at the bank desk, she finally understood that Melissa had not brought her there because something had happened. Melissa had brought her there because she wanted something to happen. The banker, a tidy woman with silver glasses and a careful voice, had begun reviewing the documents one by one. Durable power of attorney. Account access changes. Beneficiary revisions. Temporary transfer authority. Every phrase sounded dry and technical, but together they formed a trap so elegant it could have passed for care. Melissa kept tapping the line where Evelyn needed to sign, tapping it so lightly and so often that it made Evelyn's skin prickle. Then came the moment that changed everything. As the banker lifted the packet to straighten it, a small folded note slipped free from the inside pocket of the folder and landed on the desk. Melissa's face changed before anyone even opened it. Not fear. Not exactly. More like panic wrapped in embarrassment. The banker unfolded the note, read the first line, and her expression sharpened. Then she looked directly at Evelyn, no longer at Melissa, and asked in a tone so calm it became terrifying, "Mrs. Parker, before we continue, would you like these documents reviewed privately without your daughter speaking on your behalf?" In that instant, the room divided cleanly into before and after, and Evelyn understood that whatever Melissa had planned, it was no longer happening in the dark. The banker did not touch the papers again. She set the note beside the folder, folded her hands and waited. Melissa recovered first. She let out a soft laugh that sounded far too quick, then leaned toward her mother with the same polished smile she used when she wanted strangers to admire her patience. She said there had to be some misunderstanding, that her mother had been under a lot of stress since Harold passed, that everyone was simply trying to keep things organized before tax season and before anything became complicated. Evelyn heard every word. But now she also heard what sat underneath them. Melissa was not explaining. She was framing the story before anyone else could. The banker turned to Evelyn again and repeated the question, slower this time, asking whether she wanted to continue in private. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long moment. Melissa was beautifully dressed in a cream coat and heeled boots, her hair smooth, her lipstick perfect, her voice still sweet enough to fool a room. But the shine had cracked. There was tension at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes kept darting toward the note. Evelyn had spent years mistaking polished behavior for good character. She did not make that mistake now. She said yes, she would like to continue privately. Melissa blinked as if she had been slapped by the word alone. Then she said, "Mom, come on, do not do this here." But Evelyn was already standing. The movement surprised even her. Her knees were not as strong as they had been at 50, and she still felt the ache in her lower back on cold mornings. But in that moment she stood with the quiet steadiness of someone who had just found the floor beneath her feet again. The banker led her into a glass office off to the side while another employee politely asked Melissa to remain in the lobby. Through the frosted panel, Evelyn could still make out her daughter's silhouette shifting from one foot to the other. She had never seen Melissa look so uncertain. Inside the office, the banker introduced herself as Dana Whitmore, branch manager, and closed the door. Her tone stayed professional, but it softened in a way Evelyn did not expect. Dana said she wanted to review each document line by line and make sure Evelyn understood exactly what she had been asked to sign. There was no rush. There was no obligation. And if anything felt off, they would stop immediately. Evelyn nodded, but her hands were cold. Dana began with the power of attorney form. It was broad, far broader than Melissa had described, giving authority over accounts, transfers, and financial decisions under language vague enough to be dangerous. The second document added Melissa as a joint account holder on Evelyn's primary checking account. The third changed beneficiary designations tied to a savings certificate Evelyn had opened with Harold more than 20 years earlier. By the time Dana reached the fourth page, Evelyn no longer felt confused. She felt insulted. Not because the language was complicated, but because Melissa had clearly counted on her not reading it closely, on her signing from habit, from trust, from exhaustion. Dana then slid the folded note across the desk. She said it had been tucked into the folder with the forms, and because it was not addressed clearly, she wanted Evelyn to see it herself. The handwriting was not Melissa's. It was sharper, tighter, almost hurried. The note read, "Stall if she hesitates. Get signatures on the account changes first. The house can wait until next week if needed." Evelyn read it twice. Then a third time. There was no affectionate explanation that could make those words innocent. Someone had prepared strategy. Someone had broken her life into steps. First the account changes. Then the house. Dana asked gently whether Evelyn knew who might have written it. Evelyn did not answer right away. A memory had surfaced so fast it almost made her dizzy. 2 weeks earlier, Melissa had mentioned meeting with a man named Kevin, a friend who understood paperwork and could help make things easier for everyone. Evelyn had barely listened at the time. Now she remembered the way Melissa had said it, breezy and casual, while watching her mother's face too carefully. Dana continued, explaining that bank employees were trained to watch for pressure, confusion, or signs that a customer might not be acting freely. She did not accuse Melissa of anything directly, but she did not need to. The facts on the desk were accusation enough. Evelyn looked down at her wedding band, the one she still wore. On her right hand now that Harold was gone. He had always handled the long-range planning in their marriage, but he had never kept her in the dark. He used to spread papers across the kitchen table and say, "Evelyn, money tells the truth about people if you watch what they do when they think it is theirs." At the time she had laughed at the line. Sitting in that office she almost heard his voice. For the first time that day, fear gave way to something cleaner and harder. It was not rage. It was clarity. She asked Dana one question. Had anything been changed yet? Dana said no. Nothing had been processed. Nothing had been signed. Everything could still be stopped. Evelyn exhaled slowly. as if she had been holding her breath for months without knowing it. Then she lifted her eyes, straightened the stack of papers with careful fingers, and said she wanted copies of every page, the name of a lawyer who specialized in elder financial protection, and a few more minutes before she walked back out to face her daughter. Evelyn remained in Dana Whitmore's office for less than 10 minutes, but by the time she stepped back into the lobby, the balance of power had changed so completely that even Melissa seemed to feel it. Her daughter was no longer sitting. She was pacing near a display table stacked with brochures about retirement planning and college savings, pretending to glance at her phone while watching the office door every few seconds. The moment Evelyn appeared, Melissa rushed forward with a worried expression that might have fooled anyone who had not spent years loving her. She asked whether everything was all right, whether the banker had confused her, whether they should just come back another day when she was less tired. Evelyn noticed how carefully Melissa chose words that made concern sound natural, while also placing age, memory, and weakness around her mother like a frame. It was the kind of language that looked harmless until someone used it often enough to shape reality. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She simply told Melissa that nothing would be signed that day, and that she wanted the full packet returned to her. Melissa's face changed again, not dramatically, but enough. The softness fell away first. Then the patience. What remained was irritation, thinly covered by disbelief. She said they had already spent weeks organizing everything. She said appointments like this were difficult to get. She said the forms were standard and that Evelyn was making a scene over nothing. That phrase landed harder than Melissa intended. Making a scene. Evelyn thought of every holiday meal she had hosted, every school pickup she had handled, every check quietly written when Melissa was short on money, every sacrifice offered without witnesses. Women like Evelyn spent decades smoothing over scenes for other people. They kept family moving. They turned disaster into dinner and humiliation into silence. And in return, people often forgot that silence was not the same thing as surrender. Dana approached the desk with a large envelope and placed it in Evelyn's hands. Every page was inside, neatly copied and clipped. Dana also handed her a business card, and the card of an attorney whose office worked with older clients facing financial pressure from relatives. She explained that the branch had placed a temporary internal alert on Evelyn's accounts, meaning no major changes would be processed without direct verification from Evelyn herself. Melissa heard every word. Her jaw tightened. She stepped closer and asked why that would even be necessary. Dana answered in the kind of calm tone that never rose yet somehow closed every door. She said it was simply a protective measure requested by the account holder. Evelyn almost smiled at that phrase. Requested by the account holder. For the first time that day, the room was speaking about her rather than around her. On the drive home, Melissa gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles lost color. She kept trying to restart the performance, saying she had only wanted to help, that Kevin had told her these forms were routine, that everybody her age was setting up safeguards now. Evelyn asked who Kevin really was. Melissa hesitated for half a second, then said he was a financial consultant helping her get better organized after the divorce. The answer came too quickly to be trustworthy and too vaguely to be useful. Evelyn turned toward the window and let the silence stretch. Outside, late afternoon sunlight washed over the strip malls and traffic lights, over the coffee shops and dry cleaners and gas stations that made up the ordinary map of their town. Nothing in the world looked different, yet everything had shifted. Melissa finally said she could not believe her own mother would treat her like a criminal over paperwork. Evelyn looked at her daughter then, really looked at her, and saw something she had spent years avoiding. Melissa was not shocked because her plan had been misunderstood. She was shocked because it had failed. Evelyn asked her to pull over in front of a small diner 2 miles from the bank. Melissa frowned, confused, but did it. Evelyn gathered her purse, the envelope, and her coat. When Melissa asked what she was doing, Evelyn said she was having coffee alone, and that she would call a car home when she was ready. Melissa gave a strained laugh and said she was overreacting. Evelyn opened the door and stepped onto the curb before answering. She said overreacting would have been signing first and reading later. Then she closed the door gently and walked into the diner without looking back. Inside, she slid into a booth by the window, ordered decaf coffee and a bowl of chicken noodle soup, and set the envelope beside her like something both fragile and explosive. Her hands were steadier now. She took out the attorney's card and read the name twice. Thomas Avery. estate and elder financial protection. She did not call immediately. Instead, she began doing what she should have done months earlier. She made a list on the back of her receipt. Dates Melissa had asked about the will. The afternoon she requested copies of tax returns. The Mother's Day conversation about putting someone younger on the accounts. The mention of Kevin. The folder. The note. The phrase "the house can wait until next week." By the time the soup arrived, Evelyn no longer felt like a confused widow who had narrowly escaped a mistake. She felt like the first witness in her own case. And as she looked through the diner window at her daughter's car idling at the curb for one long minute before finally pulling away, Evelyn understood one thing with perfect clarity. Melissa had assumed age had made her mother easier to move. She was about to learn that it had made her harder to fool. The next morning, Evelyn woke before sunrise, not because she had slept well, but because her mind had spent the night arranging details into order. The house was still dark, the kind of quiet Harold used to love on Sunday mornings when he would stand in the kitchen grinding coffee beans and reading the paper in his robe. For a few seconds, habit almost fooled her into expecting that sound again. Then reality returned, along with the envelope from the bank resting on the dining room table where she had left it. She wrapped both hands around a mug of tea and sat down in the pale kitchen light, reading every page again, slower this time. Without Melissa in the room, without the soft pressure of her voice and the manufactured urgency, the documents looked even colder than they had the day before. They did not read like help. They read like access, authority, transfer, control. Words designed to sound efficient, while quietly moving one life into someone else's hands. Evelyn took out a yellow legal pad and began another list. This one was longer. She wrote down each moment from the past year that now seemed less like concern and more like rehearsal. The first had happened the month after Harold's funeral, when Melissa offered to help sort the office and insisted that important papers should not be left where someone could misplace them. At the time, Evelyn had been too exhausted to argue. She let Melissa stack folders, label drawers, and carry away a slim file box with old statements that Melissa claimed she would scan for safekeeping. Then there was the afternoon in late August when Melissa stopped by with iced coffee and asked, in a tone so casual it almost disappeared, whether the house title had been updated after Harold died. Evelyn remembered answering that Harold had planned carefully, and that their attorney had handled everything years ago. Melissa had gone very still for half a beat before smiling again and changing the subject to weather. In October, she asked whether Evelyn ever considered downsizing, saying a smaller place would be easier to manage and would free up equity. The word itself had sounded odd in her daughter's mouth, too technical for a woman who once ignored overdue parking tickets until the final notice arrived. At Thanksgiving, Melissa offered to host but still arrived early to Evelyn's house and spent 10 minutes in the study with the desk drawers open, saying she had been looking for extra candles. On Christmas Eve, she brought a new planner and spent more time discussing deadlines, beneficiaries, and passwords than traditions, meals, or family. Evelyn wrote it all down, each memory settling into place with a clarity that made her stomach tighten. What hurt her most was not the possibility that Melissa wanted money. Money could make people foolish, needy, even selfish. What hurt was the patience of it. The planning. The way Melissa had wrapped ambition in the language of care, and assumed her mother would never separate the two. By 9 o'clock, Evelyn had called Thomas Avery's office and secured an appointment for that afternoon. The receptionist's voice was kind but efficient, and when Evelyn briefly explained that a relative had attempted to rush her through financial paperwork at a bank, the woman did not sound shocked. She sounded familiar. That alone told Evelyn more than she wanted to know about how often stories like hers began in tidy offices with polished smiles. Before leaving the house, she checked the small fireproof box in her bedroom closet where Harold used to keep estate papers. The box was still there, but the contents were thinner than she remembered. The original trust summary remained, along with the deed copy and Harold's old life insurance records. But one folder was missing entirely. It was the folder labeled Durable Directives and Account Authority, the same set of documents Melissa had once offered to organize for her. Evelyn sat back on her heels and closed the lid carefully. She did not cry. She was past that stage now. Instead, she felt that same hard, cooling clarity return. Melissa had not stumbled into temptation. She had been building toward this. When Evelyn drove to Thomas Avery's office after lunch, She wore the camel coat Harold always said made her look impossible to push around. The law firm occupied the second floor of a brick building above a pharmacy and a travel agency. Modest from the outside and steady from the inside. Thomas Avery was in his early 60s, silver-haired, direct, and entirely unimpressed by drama. He listened without interrupting as Evelyn laid out the copied forms, the note, the missing folder, and the timeline she had written by hand. When she finished, he did not offer sympathy first. He offered facts. If Melissa had been trying to obtain signatures under pressure, that mattered. If original estate documents had gone missing after gaining access to the Home Office, that mattered. If someone named Kevin had helped prepare strategy notes for staged account changes, that mattered even more. Then he asked the question that shifted everything again. He wanted to know whether Harold had ever mentioned a secondary control structure for the estate, something designed to activate if anyone attempted to interfere with Evelyn's authority. Evelyn frowned, searching her memory. Then she remembered a winter evening years earlier, Harold sitting at the kitchen table with his reading glasses low on his nose, saying in that calm, practical voice of his that if anyone ever pushed too hard around money, the documents would know what to do. At the time she had laughed and called him dramatic. Sitting across from Thomas Avery now, Evelyn no longer thought it had been drama at all. It had been foresight. And for the first time since leaving the bank, she began to suspect that Melissa was not only failing to take control. She might already have triggered the very protection Harold had put in place. Thomas Avery did not keep Evelyn waiting long. He excused himself for less than 5 minutes, then returned carrying a thin gray folder and an expression that was almost too controlled to read. He sat down across from her, placed the folder on the desk, and said Harold Parker had been even more careful than most people realized. Years earlier, Harold had amended the family trust after watching one of his cousins lose half of a small estate to pressure from adult children, who began by offering help and ended by demanding control. He had not become paranoid. He had become precise. Thomas opened the folder and explained that Harold had added a dormant safeguard clause, a legal mechanism that stayed invisible unless certain actions were attempted. If someone other than Evelyn tried to alter account access, redirect authority, or pressure a transfer through incomplete disclosure, the trust allowed immediate review, suspension of discretionary benefits, and mandatory outside oversight before any asset movement could continue. Evelyn stared at him, absorbing each word slowly. She asked whether that meant Melissa had triggered it simply by preparing the documents. Thomas said intent mattered, but conduct mattered more. The note, the rushed signing attempt, the broad power language, and the missing folder together created a pattern no court would ignore and no serious attorney would dismiss. Then he said something that made Evelyn sit straighter. Melissa might have believed she was moving toward control, but legally she may have done the opposite. She may have placed herself under scrutiny before gaining anything at all. Thomas turned the trust summary toward Evelyn and pointed to a section Harold had titled Family Integrity Review. The phrase was so unmistakably Harold that Evelyn almost smiled through the ache in her chest. He had always believed titles mattered because they told people what a document was really for. Under that section, the language allowed the acting attorney to freeze proposed benefit expansions to any family member whose behavior suggested manipulation, concealment, or coercion involving the surviving spouse. Evelyn read the lines twice, hearing Harold in every careful phrase. He had known something she had not wanted to imagine. He had known that grief and age could make a widow vulnerable not only to strangers, but to people sitting at her own table. Thomas then asked for permission to contact the bank, request preservation of internal notes connected to the attempted signing, and begin formal recovery of any estate documents that had been removed from Evelyn's home without authorization. Evelyn gave permission immediately. The speed of her answer surprised even her. 2 days earlier she would have hesitated, worried about making things too serious, too public, too painful. Now she understood that hesitation was the oxygen people like Melissa depended on. Thomas also recommended changing the locks on her home office, updating online banking credentials, and preparing a limited written notice instructing all institutions to communicate directly with Evelyn, unless confirmed through his office. Nothing about the advice sounded theatrical. That was what made it powerful. It was not revenge. It was structure. On the drive home, Evelyn stopped at a hardware store and bought a locking file cabinet, a fireproof document case, and a new deadbolt for the side door Melissa used most often when dropping by unannounced. She did not enjoy making those purchases. Each item felt like a small admission that trust had become a luxury she could no longer afford. But there was also relief in the action. She was no longer just reacting. She was building lines Melissa would not cross again. By late afternoon, her kitchen table had turned into a command center of labeled folders, legal pads, and copied statements. She called the locksmith. She called the bank. She called the insurance office to verify beneficiary records. Each conversation revealed the same thing in different words. Evelyn still held the authority. She had almost been maneuvered into handing it away, but almost was not the same as done. Near 6 o'clock, her phone lit up with Melissa's name. Evelyn let it ring once, twice, then answered on the fourth ring. Melissa sounded softer than she had the day before, almost wounded. She said she hated how things had ended at the bank. She said Kevin had probably overcomplicated the paperwork. She said she only wanted to spare her mother future stress. Evelyn listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question in an even tone. She asked why the note said the house could wait until next week. Silence flooded the line so completely that Evelyn could hear the hum of her own refrigerator in the kitchen. Melissa recovered by asking what note, but it was too late. That silence had already answered. Evelyn said an attorney was now involved, no further documents would be discussed without counsel, and any property belonging to her estate that had been removed from the house needed to be returned intact by Friday at noon. Melissa let out a stunned breath and said, "You got a lawyer over this?" Evelyn replied that no, she got a lawyer because of this. Then she ended the call. An hour later, while filing old receipts into the new cabinet, Evelyn found something she had not expected. Tucked inside one of Harold's tax binders was a sealed envelope with her name in his handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated 3 years before his death. It was not a legal document, just a note. Harold wrote that if she was reading it, someone had probably mistaken her kindness for confusion. He wrote that the trust was built to protect her first, and that anyone who tried to get clever around grief, age, or family ties would discover that he had planned for clever people. Evelyn sat very still at the table, the note in her hands, evening light stretching across the floorboards. For the first time since the bank, she did not feel only betrayed. She felt backed up across time, by the one man who had understood both her softness and her strength. And somewhere beyond the quiet of her house, Melissa still believed this was a disagreement she could smooth over with the right tone. She did not yet understand that the matter had already changed shape. It was no longer about persuading her mother. It was about surviving what Harold had left behind for exactly this moment. Friday arrived with the kind of thin gray sky that made the whole town look washed in steel, and by 11:45 Evelyn was already seated at her dining room table with the return document box in front of her, unopened, a yellow legal pad to one side, and Thomas Avery on speakerphone. Melissa had not brought the box herself. She had sent a courier service, as if distance could make the contents feel less personal. The label carried Evelyn's address in Melissa's handwriting, neat and composed. The same careful script she used on birthday cards and thank you notes and every other small performance of affection that now seemed to belong to another life. Thomas had advised her not to open anything alone, not because he expected drama, but because order mattered. Chain of custody mattered. Dates mattered. The difference between what had been borrowed and what had been removed without permission mattered. Evelyn cut the tape slowly and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 hanging folders, a slim accordion file, and a small leather planner she had not realized was missing. She recognized each item instantly. Melissa had not taken random papers. She had selected tax records, trust summaries, insurance statements, a copy of the house deed, notes from meetings Harold once had with attorneys. It was not the chaos of someone helping too aggressively. It was the method of someone looking for leverage. Thomas asked her to read off each label while he made a record. When she reached the accordion file, she found the missing directives folder inside, along with 2 photocopied pages marked in yellow where signature lines appeared. One page had a sticky note attached that read, "Ask her after church. She is softer on Sundays." Evelyn stared at the words until they blurred for a second, then sharpened again. Thomas asked her to repeat what she saw, and she did, Her voice steady even though something old and quiet inside her was breaking for good. Melissa had not been planning one bad afternoon. She had been studying her mother's habits the way salespeople studied weak points in a pitch. After the inventory was complete, Thomas told Evelyn he had enough to send a formal demand for preservation of all related communications, including messages with Kevin. He also intended to notify Melissa that any future attempt to seek account authority, title access, or estate documentation outside counsel would be treated as evidence of continued coercive conduct. The language was legal, but the meaning was simple. Melissa was no longer moving through family space. She was moving through a documented case file. After the call ended, Evelyn sat alone in the quiet house and looked around the room she had lived in for nearly 30 years. The grandfather clock Harold loved stood in the corner, still 10 minutes fast because he claimed punctuality deserved a head start. The framed beach photo from Cape Cod still hung above the sideboard, taken the summer Melissa turned 14, all sunburned cheeks and windblown hair and no hint yet of the woman who would one day map her mother's softness on sticky notes. Grief moved strangely through a house like that. It did not always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrived as recognition. Evelyn was not only mourning Harold now. She was mourning the version of motherhood that believed love, given long enough, would teach gratitude. At 3:15 Dana Whitmore called from the bank. Her tone remained careful, but there was a note of confirmation in it now. She said internal review had uncovered that Melissa had phoned the branch twice in the week before the appointment, asking what identification an older customer needed to add someone to accounts and whether confusion would delay processing, if the older person seemed uncertain but agreeable. Dana could not discuss every internal detail, but she wanted Evelyn to know the questions had been documented. Evelyn thanked her and wrote everything down. Another piece slid into place. Melissa had not walked into the bank hoping for help. She had rehearsed the scene in advance. That evening, just after sunset, a text appeared on Evelyn's phone. It was from Melissa. No greeting. No apology. Just one line. I hope you are happy embarrassing your own daughter over paperwork. You do not even understand. Evelyn read it once and set the phone face down on the table. 20 years earlier, words like that would have shattered her night. She would have called back, over-explained, begged the relationship not to fray. Now she saw the message for what it was. Not pain. Pressure. An attempt to drag her back into the old role where Melissa acted and Evelyn absorbed the consequences. She did not reply. Instead, she opened Harold's note again and read the sentence about clever people. Then she took out a fresh page and began drafting her own timeline in final form, not as a wounded mother trying to make sense of betrayal, but as the lawful surviving spouse of Harold Parker, primary authority holder, account owner, homeowner, and woman of sound mind. By the time the porch light clicked on automatically outside, she had something stronger than anger. She had sequence, proof, names, dates, copies, and silence where Melissa wanted emotion. And somewhere between the courier box, the sticky note, and the documented calls to the bank, Evelyn understood with complete certainty that the next move would not belong to her daughter. Monday morning began with a letter Melissa did not expect to receive. It arrived by certified mail just after 9, printed on Thomas Avery's letterhead, precise and unsentimental. Evelyn did not see Melissa open it, but she could imagine the shift in her daughter's face as each paragraph stripped away the safety of ambiguity. The letter demanded preservation of all records related to any attempt to obtain authority over Evelyn Parker's accounts, property, estate documents, or personal records. It instructed Melissa to cease all direct contact with financial institutions regarding Evelyn. It requested disclosure of any communications with Kevin or any third party involved in preparing, advising on, or strategizing document execution. And at the center of it sat the sentence that mattered most. Pursuant to the Family Integrity Review provision established by Harold Parker, any discretionary benefit or future consideration involving Melissa Parker was suspended pending legal review. Thomas had warned Evelyn that this clause might feel severe when she saw it enforced. It did not. It felt exact. Around noon, Thomas called with the next piece of information. Kevin was not a licensed financial advisor. He was a real estate broker who had once worked with Melissa's former husband on a failed property flip, and had no legal standing to structure estate transfers or advise on banking authority. More importantly, Thomas's office had uncovered an email chain Melissa did not yet know they had obtained. Kevin had sent her a list of suggestions under the subject line transition strategy. The wording was polished, but the meaning was plain. Build urgency. Emphasize safety. Present signature pages first. Keep the meeting friendly. If resistance appears, suggest confusion is normal at her age. Thomas read the phrases aloud without emotion. Evelyn wrote them down one by one, each word landing with the weight of proof rather than shock. She had already known what Melissa was willing to do. Now the record knew it too. That afternoon, Thomas asked Evelyn to come by the office again because there was one more issue Harold's trust required them to address. When she arrived, he handed her a summary sheet showing the estate structure in plain English. The family home, the principal savings accounts, and the long-term investment fund were protected under the trust, with Evelyn as sole lifetime controlling beneficiary. Melissa had expected access through proximity, but proximity was not authority. In fact, the safeguard clause did more than freeze improper attempts. If a named family member engaged in manipulative conduct toward Evelyn in pursuit of financial benefit, that conduct could trigger a review of inheritance expectations entirely. Evelyn looked up from the paper and asked the question slowly, as if saying it too quickly might make it cruel. She asked whether Melissa could actually lose what Harold intended her to receive later. Thomas did not dramatize the answer. He said yes, depending on the findings, and depending on whether Evelyn wished to amend her estate documents in light of demonstrated conduct. The room fell quiet after that. Outside the office window, a city bus pulled away from the curb and a woman in a red scarf hurried across the crosswalk with a coffee in one hand. Ordinary life continued with insulting ease. Inside, Evelyn sat with the fact that Melissa had reached so eagerly for control that she might have damaged the very future she was counting on. Thomas added that courts and trustees did not punish people for family tension. They acted when patterns showed deception, pressure, or attempted exploitation. This was not about hurt feelings. It was about documented behavior. Evelyn nodded. The distinction mattered. By the time she drove home, the feeling inside her had changed again. The first stage had been confusion. Then came pain. Then clarity. What she felt now was distance. Not coldness exactly, but distance wide enough to see the architecture of the whole thing. Melissa had not lost her balance in grief or panic over bills. She had built a plan around her mother's age, her widowhood, her routines, her church schedule, and the trust that usually comes with being called mom. That evening Melissa called 3 times. Evelyn let each call go to voicemail. The first message sounded offended. The second sounded tearful. By the third, Melissa's voice was sharper, asking why lawyers were involved and accusing Evelyn of overreacting to paperwork that had never been finalized. Evelyn saved every message and forwarded them to Thomas's office. Then she did something Melissa would never have predicted. She hosted her regular Tuesday supper one night early, and invited her sister June and her longtime neighbor Patricia over for meatloaf, green beans, and mashed potatoes. She did not tell them every detail, only enough. Enough to make the truth real outside her own head. Enough to replace secrecy with witnesses. June sat back in her chair and said what Evelyn had been slowly learning to believe. She said people only rush signatures when they know patience would expose them. Patricia nodded and added that predators did not always look like strangers. Sometimes they brought pie at Thanksgiving. They all laughed at that, but the laugh carried steel. After they left, Evelyn loaded the dishwasher, wiped down the counters and looked around her quiet kitchen. She realized the story Melissa had counted on was gone. There would be no isolated widow second-guessing herself in private. There would be no embarrassed mother hiding what almost happened because family should stay family. There would only be record, counsel, and choice. And as she turned off the light above the sink, Evelyn understood the final truth Melissa had missed from the beginning. The trap had never been the paperwork. The trap was believing her mother would still protect her from the consequences of her own greed. Melissa came to the house on Thursday evening just before 6, wearing a soft gray sweater and carrying a bakery box as if cinnamon rolls could still purchase innocence. Evelyn watched from the front window for a moment before opening the door. Her daughter stood on the porch with that same careful expression she had used all week in voicemails, half injured, half offended, as though she had been wronged by the existence of boundaries. She said she did not want lawyers deciding what happened between Mother and daughter. Evelyn stepped aside and let her in, not out of softness, but because some conversations deserved witnesses and an ending. June was already seated at the dining room table with a legal pad in front of her, and Patricia was in the kitchen pouring coffee into 3 cups. Melissa stopped the moment she saw them. The bakery box dipped slightly in her hand. For the first time since the bank, she looked genuinely unprepared. Evelyn told her she could sit if she wanted, but this would not be a private conversation and nothing discussed in the house would change the legal process already underway. Melissa set the box on the counter without opening it. She said this was unbelievable, that Evelyn was humiliating her in front of other people over forms that had never even been signed. Evelyn remained standing at the end of the table, one hand resting lightly on the chair Harold used to pull out every evening after dinner. She said this was not about humiliation. It was about intention. Melissa gave a short disbelieving laugh and said intention could not be proven. That was when Evelyn reached into the folder on the table and placed 3 items in a row. First, the copied account forms from the bank. Second, the note that had slipped from the folder. Third, the sticky note that read, "Ask her after church. She is softer on Sundays." The room went still in a way that made every small sound matter. The refrigerator motor kicked on. A spoon tapped once against a mug in the kitchen. Melissa looked at the notes, then at her mother, and something in her posture changed. She was still beautiful, still polished, still trying to control her breathing, but the performance had broken apart. She said Kevin had written things down in a way that made them sound worse than they were. She said he was only trying to help her get organized because Evelyn was getting older and forgetting things. June made a quiet sound at that. Not outrage exactly, more disgust sharpened into discipline. Evelyn did not take the bait. She asked one question. If Melissa truly believed she was helping, why had she called the bank ahead of time to ask whether confusion could be pushed through if an older customer seemed agreeable? Melissa's eyes flicked up too fast. Then she said she had only wanted to understand the process. Evelyn placed Dana Whitmore's written summary on the table beside the other papers. She said the process was understood now. Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around the room as if searching for the version of herself that usually worked best. The misunderstood daughter, the practical one, the overburdened single mother, the woman doing her best. None of them landed. Patricia finally spoke from the kitchen doorway, and said that help did not need strategy notes. It did not need urgency scripts. It did not need reminders about what day a widow might be emotionally softer. Melissa turned red, not from shame exactly, but from the shock of no longer controlling the frame. She said everyone was acting like she had tried to rob her own mother, and that if Evelyn had just trusted her for one more week, everything would have been cleaner and easier. The sentence hung in the air after she said it, so naked in its logic that even she seemed to realize too late what had come out. One more week. Cleaner and easier. Not clearer. Not safer. Not fairer. Evelyn looked at her daughter with a calm she had not known she still possessed. She said that was the first honest thing Melissa had said in days. Then she told her what Thomas Avery had confirmed that morning. The family integrity review had already been triggered. Discretionary benefits were suspended. The trust was under review. Any expectation of future access now depended on findings Melissa had created with her own conduct. Melissa stared at her as if the language itself were foreign. Then she said Harold would never have wanted this. Evelyn almost smiled. She said Harold had planned exactly for this. That answer hit harder than anger could have. Melissa sank into the nearest chair, and for a brief second looked less like a strategist than a child who had finally reached the edge of what charm could fix. She asked, in a smaller voice now, whether Evelyn was really willing to destroy their relationship over paperwork. Evelyn said no. The paperwork had only revealed what the relationship had become. No one spoke after that for several seconds. Outside, a car passed with music low through an open window. Ordinary life moving down the street as if families did not split apart in dining rooms every day. Melissa stood, smoothed her sweater, and asked if there was anything she could do to make this go away. Evelyn said yes. She could stop lying. She could stop calling institutions. She could stop pretending this began with concern. And she could leave. Melissa looked at the unopened bakery box one last time, then at the papers on the table, then at her mother. Whatever she saw in Evelyn's face finally convinced her that the woman standing there was no longer available for guilt, confusion, or rescue. She turned and walked out without taking the pastries. When the front door closed, June exhaled first. Patricia quietly carried the box to the trash without opening it. Evelyn stood in the middle of her kitchen, listening to the silence settle around the house, and understood that the confrontation had not broken her family in that moment. It had only removed the last curtain hiding what greed had already done. A week later, the legal review was no longer a threat hanging in the air. It was a matter of record. Thomas Avery called Evelyn just after 10 on Friday morning and told her the trustee had completed the initial findings. Melissa's conduct, combined with the documented bank inquiries, the strategy notes, the removed estate files, and the attempted rush signing, had established a clear pattern of manipulation tied to financial gain. The result was not dramatic in the way television teaches people to expect. No one shouted. No doors slammed. No one came to the house with flashing lights. The consequences were quieter than that and far more permanent. Melissa's discretionary standing under Harold's trust was suspended indefinitely. Any future distributions that had once been anticipated in broad family terms would now require independent review, and could be redirected entirely at Evelyn's discretion through lawful amendment. The accounts were locked behind enhanced verification. The deed records were flagged. Formal notice had gone to every institution that mattered. By the time Thomas finished speaking, the world outside Evelyn's kitchen window looked exactly the same as it had the month before, and yet her life had been returned to her in full. She thanked him, wrote down each point in careful block letters, and then sat for a long moment with the phone still in her hand. Relief did not come as joy. It came as steadiness, like standing upright, after weeks of bracing against wind. That afternoon, Evelyn drove herself to First Community Bank wearing the same navy cardigan she had worn the day everything first tilted. Dana Whitmore greeted her with the kind of warm professionalism that never crossed into pity. They reviewed the final protections on the accounts, updated communication instructions, and closed out the last internal notes connected to the attempted changes. When it was done, Dana smiled and said, "Mrs. Parker, everything now reflects exactly what you asked for and nothing more." Evelyn heard the sentence as more than a banking confirmation. Felt like a correction to the whole story. For months, perhaps longer, people had been trying to move her life by implying that easier meant better, that simpler meant safer, that someone younger should naturally step in. Now the record said what she had finally learned to say for herself. Exactly what you asked for and nothing more. On her way out, Evelyn paused in the lobby near the desk where Melissa had once tried to steer her hand toward a signature line. The brochures were still there. The polished floor still reflected the overhead lights. A young father bounced a toddler on one hip while waiting in line. An older man in a denim jacket counted cash twice before approaching the counter. Ordinary people doing ordinary things. Evelyn stood there only a few seconds, but long enough to feel the distance between who she had been that day and who she was now. She had walked into the bank as a widow, still assuming love would explain what facts could not. She walked out now as a woman who understood that dignity required structure, and that kindness without boundaries was not virtue. It was an invitation. Melissa did not call again after the final notice was served. She sent one short email through her own attorney requesting that family matters remain private and expressing regret for misunderstandings. Thomas forwarded it without comment. Evelyn read it once and recognized the last performance for what it was. Regret without truth. Distance without accountability. She instructed Thomas to respond only as necessary and then let the matter rest where the record had placed it. A few days later, Evelyn met with him one final time to update her own estate plan. She made no rash decisions. That was what pleased her most. Nothing about her response came from temper. She created a smaller protected educational fund for her grandchildren, supervised by an independent fiduciary. She directed a charitable gift to the county library in Harold's name. She revised the remainder of her estate with clear conditions, clear oversight, and no loose space for anyone to interpret affection as access. When Thomas slid the final documents across the desk for review, Evelyn read every line before signing. Her hand did not shake once. That Sunday she went to church alone, sat in the same pew she and Harold had shared for years, and listened to the choir without forcing herself to feel forgiving or noble or transformed. Peace she was learning was not always warm. Sometimes it was simply clean. After the service, June took her to lunch at the diner near the highway, and they split a slice of coconut cream pie the way they used to when they were girls. June asked how she felt now that everything was settled. Evelyn looked out the window at the rows of parked cars shimmering under the noon sun and considered the question carefully. She said she felt expensive. June laughed so hard she nearly dropped her fork, but Evelyn meant it. Not expensive in dollars. Expensive in the sense that access to her life would no longer be cheap. It would not be bought with flattery, urgency, guilt, or familiar words spoken in a tender tone. It would have to be earned by honesty, and that was a price Melissa had refused to pay. When Evelyn returned home that afternoon, she opened the front door to a house that felt fully hers again. The lock turned smoothly. The air carried the faint scent of lemon polish, and the roses Patricia had left on the counter earlier that week. Harold's note was still in the top drawer of the dining room cabinet, where she had placed it for safekeeping. She touched the drawer handle but did not open it. She did not need to. By then, she no longer required a reminder that someone had believed in her strength before she remembered it herself. She crossed the living room, pulled back the curtains, and let the late light fill the house from front to back. Nothing had been taken. Not the accounts. Not the house. Not her name on the papers. And in the end, the thing Melissa lost was larger than money. She lost the privilege of being trusted by a woman who had once given her every chance to be loved without measure. Evelyn stood in the bright quiet of her own home, and understood that justice had not arrived as revenge. It had arrived as order. Calm, documented, lawful order. The kind that did not need raised voices because it had truth on its side. Then she turned from the window, straightened the frame of the Cape Cod photograph on the sideboard, and walked toward the kitchen to start dinner, not like a woman recovering from betrayal, but like the rightful owner of her own life.